You're listening to the 95 Podcast from the team at 95 Network, where we host conversations specifically designed to support leaders in small and mid-sized churches.
Hey, everybody. Welcome back to the 95 Podcast. This is Dale Sellers, Executive Director of 95 Network. And I have an awesome guest on with us today. Gavin Adams was with me a couple of years ago, just having a conversation around health and stuff before we knew how unhealthy we were in ministry. But today we have him on because he's actually written a great new book, and I'm excited to learn about the book. But first of all, Gavin, welcome to the podcast.
Hey, Dale, thanks for having me on. Good to see you again, as always.
You too, man. I know you're friends with Tony Morgan, and I think, Tony and because my daughter Tiffany works with Unstuck, and the way he's treated her, I just think the world of Tony.
I love Tony. He and I talk at least once a month. He actually endorsed the book for me, and we spend some time together.
Well, he pushed it so hard, and literally, I just saw that you'd released the book, and Tony pushed it. I'm getting Gavin on talking about the book. I know nothing about it, and we'll learn about that in a minute. But before we do, kind of catch everybody up with, especially people who may not know who you are. Tell us a little bit of your story, and then we'll kind of get towards the book.
Yeah, no problem. I'll do a very quick version. I grew up in the church and had no idea I'd ever work in a church. In fact, that's the last thing I wanted to do. But studied marketing and got an MBA in marketing and worked in the marketplace for a decade. But before God kind of called me into ministry, so I've spent the last probably 18 years in ministry at this point. Had some overlap there, so I'm not quite as old as that makes me sound, but. Some bivocational time, but I got to help launch a church and became a lead pastor of Woodstock City Church that currently is and was a campus location with North Point Ministry. So I got to work with North Point and Andy for a long time. And so 2.5 years ago, I really just felt kind of it was time. The season was ending, and it was time to move on. I'd been developing a leader to take my place for a long time, and felt like it was time to move on and help other churches as well. So I finished my doctorate at the same time and kind of wanted to do something with that. I studied church revitalization, which is really about change and transformation. Leadership is kind of what that is. And so wanted to help churches. That's still my passion. I work with some marketplace leaders and do some coaching in that world, but my passion is for the local church and the kingdom. And so right now, I've spent the last 2.5 years working with churches, specifically coaching pastors, coaching leaders on communication, preaching, on organizational strategy, discipleship pathways, and just staff health. And so that's a little bit of why I ended up writing the book that just came out last week around all that stuff.
So give us an overview of what you are seeing as you work with churches all across the country, as far as how would you, rate where we are today, I guess is the way I'd say that.
Yeah, I feel like the easiest way to rate it, how in the kind of economic ecosystem we say that the middle class is kind of going away. I feel like that's kind of happening in churches. I feel like there are either things are going well or they're going terrible. There's no middle ground right now, it feels like.
Wow.
I wish I could say, and here's the one thing that's making the difference, but it's more complex than that. Every community is unique. There's too much complexity to it. The one positive, though, is that churches are typically notoriously slow to change and slow to evolve. I think that if nothing else, the last 3-4 years has taught us that we can't afford to be slow to evolve and change our methodology, not our mission, not our heart for Christ and the church and the community, but how we accomplish it. I think we've all learned, 2020 taught us that everything's out of our control anyway. So
absolutely,
we have to adjust and we have to be quicker to do it. So that's one thing. I think churches are, by and large, recognizing that we have to evolve a little more quickly to what we're seeing in and around us community-wise. I think the other thing that's been a very positive thing is I've studied this because I'm so fascinated by it, but we have progressed through several different versions of the economy and now we're in what we call the experience economy. So churches that are more experiential in nature, this is why we've seen Pentecostal churches kind of come back a little more quickly. It's because you can't experience that digitally and have the same experience. And so we are in a world now where Like it or not, everyone is consuming experiences. And so our churches
Mm,
have to be a little bit more experiential driven to make it worth attending and make it worth engaging with. And so we're watching churches that are creating, and I don't mean attractional experiences. This isn't like we have pyrotechnics and fireworks. I
sure.
just mean that there's a real tangible presence of the Holy Spirit. There's a
They want to
tangible,
encounter God.
that's right. Yeah, there's a transcendence is the word that I like for it.
Isn't it weird that we had to figure that out?
Well, I mean, that's the thing, right? Like it's not even generational, but every whatever, 10, 15 years, there's
Hmm.
as the economy, as the culture, as things evolve,
Hmm.
there is a new way that we need to package, present, engage our community, the unchurched, de-churched, and church community.
Hmm.
And I think there's a third category to this too, by the way, back to your first question. I think forever we lived in this world of binary church people and unchurched, de-church people. But
Yeah.
I think there's this third category of very marginally, very immature church people
Ooh,
that are
yeah.
in the middle. And that's our fault, by the way. We allowed that to
Hmm.
be created. But
Hmm.
there is this third category, and you see it in the research. You see it that there's people who claim church, and it's really cultural, right? I mean,
Yes.
it felt like that there was a season, a decade, or maybe even 15 years ago, where going to church was expected and you benefited from being there. You could be seen and see and all that.
Hmm.
And what's really happened is because there was such a lack of depth in their spiritual life and in their spiritual growth that, I mean, in fact, that book, The Great De-Churching, is an unbelievable read. Every
Hmm.
pastor should read this book, I believe. But it talks a lot about this, that there was this incredible generational mishandoff in this.
Hmm.
The way that, we want to blame the next generation for being unchurched, but the reason they're unchurched is because of the way the parents raised them.
Hmm.
And the way that parents engaged with them was because of their lack of spiritual depth. And
Hmm.
so that's on us as pastors, right? So we kind of allowed that to happen. So there's this third category of people who we wouldn't say are unchurched or de-churched, but when it comes to their faith, they're just being tossed back and forth by the waves, and there's
Yep.
no roots and depth to any of it for them. And now that being in church isn't beneficial for them,
Hmm.
they're choosing to be there very infrequently because, when it was always a consumption, right?
Hmm.
And so when they were consuming something that felt like it was benefiting them, they kept consuming, but now it isn't cultural. It's not
Hmm.
expected. So therefore, it isn't as beneficial. So therefore, we're not seeing them as much. There's this
You know,
weird third category we got to figure out.
yeah, Tiffany, who works at Unstuck, just did an Instagram post just a couple of weeks ago that I actually reposted, who talked about, they worked with 500 churches last year, and about
Mhm.
half of them were churches experiencing explosive growth, but the leadership were like, we don't know how to minister to this group of people that's coming because it's a new demographic, if you will,
Exactly.
of people who've come and who did not necessarily go before. But then the other half were people, churches just they're dying, they're just
Yep.
flat. And so, which kind of bears out exactly what you said earlier with the
Yeah.
dynamic of what we're dealing with. So
Well,
it's
the
an
churches,
interesting time to be a pastor.
oh man, well, I assume it's always been interesting, but at least in my lifetime of doing it right now is more complex. I mean, I didn't work with 500 churches last year, but like Tony, maybe one day, but even in the 50 that I've engaged with in the last year, I would say it's the same thing. Half of them are exploding. I mean, I was
Mhm.
just preaching and doing some strategy work with a team in Tampa this past weekend, and we're working on a building expansion, and they're doing such incredible things. But you know what? In talking to them, their church is growing like crazy, but it is a
Mhm.
completely different church than it was pre-pandemic.
Mhm.
The population is different. The needs are different. I mean, it's just fascinating
Yeah.
how it has evolved, right? Because they were willing to evolve, though.
What are people looking when these churches that are all of a sudden we're starting to hear pockets of explosive growth?
Yeah.
What is it that the people are looking for that are coming to these churches? Is there any been surveys that let us know?
Well, I haven't seen anything that is a survey or a research study that I can point to and say, aha, this is it.
Yeah.
However, I can tell you from my experience, so this is anecdotal.
Mhm.
I think there's two things, and one we absolutely better get away from, and the other is where we should run to. The
Mhm.
one we got to get away from, but it's helping churches grow, is the churches, but it's unhealthy growth. It's the churches that are growing on the backs of other people's death
Yes. Yeah. That's
because they have
yeah.
decided, and this drives me nuts, but they have decided to grow their church by allowing their Sunday morning experience to sound like everyone's Monday night cable news network experience.
You got to dive into that a little bit.
Well, they have decided to engage with this evangelical right wing, and I'm not taking a stance on this. Well, I am, but I mean not on the political side.
Mm-hmm.
But they are engaging in almost turning the church into a political rally.
Nationalism.
Where, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And they're growing their church because people, and I mean, if we could make it biblical, they're tickling the ears and saying what people want to hear.
Yeah.
And they're not really challenging them on discipleship. They're just preaching to the choir the red meat of the right-wing conservative political movement. And it is unhealthy for their church. It's unhealthy for the spiritual growth of the people. And
Well,
so
it's not sustainable either.
no. And
Yeah.
and so, but we're seeing a lot of churches that are for the sake of growth,
Mm-hmm.
caving to that. The other side, though, the healthy growth, are the ones that are reaching the people who are truly looking for hope and help in Christ. Or sorry, they're looking for hope and help, and they don't know it's in Christ.
Yeah. Yeah.
And we're helping them discover hope and help for their life today and in eternity through the gospel. And those are the churches that are attacking hard issues, but they're attacking it on all sides. They're willing to have hard conversation, but not placate to one side of any political aisle or theological or ideological aisle. They're really trying to reach everyone who God loves, which is everyone.
Yep.
And that's a tough thing to do. I mean, I got a lot of friends in this space that get a lot of hate, but I don't want to go off too much on this, but just I think this is important. Every one of these hard topics, we typically, in fact, I just wrote about this. I haven't released the blog yet. I got to figure out when or how to make it sound right. But we have so many people who want to take stances, but they don't have any solutions.
Yes. That's
And
not helpful.
And I just don't have a lot of tolerance for that. Like, when we think about our theology is kind of like our mission. If you're at an organization, you have a mission. Your goal is to accomplish the mission. Your strategy, though, is how you hope to achieve accomplishing the mission.
Mm-hmm.
That's how ministry works. Ministry is the strategy for how you want to lead people to the theology that you buy into.
Mm-hmm.
So pick a topic, your theological stance is good. You need to have one. However, you better have a solution to disciple people from where they are to where the target is.
Yes.
And too many churches. So the ones that are growing are the ones that have a stance, but also have a solution, that are able to allow people to feel welcome, loved, and accepted where they are, but at the same time have a solution and a plan to help them grow in their Christ-likeness, and trust that in time, Jesus will take care of the things that need to be dealt with.
I think for me growing up, church was a lot of clean yourself up and then come to church.
Yeah.
And which is not the gospel.
No.
And so, and in a roundabout way, that's basically what you're saying is that people
Correct.
say, hey, meet people where they are and have solutions for what their issues. Don't compromise the truth,
No.
but have solutions. And so I think you're dead on there. I can't wait to read that blog.
Well, yeah, I'm still working through it. I mean,
Yeah.
I use some of the hard topics about it. I mean,
Sure.
you just a really quick precursor, but like I saw, Jim Harbaugh, just won the national championship with Michigan. He was at a pro-life rally. And again, regardless of where you are on the topic, he was there. They interviewed him, and I appreciated this. He said, I've always been pro-life, to which, of course, he would say that he's at the pro-life rally. But then he said, I've told my players since the beginning of my coaching career and everyone in my family, if you find yourself in an unwanted pregnancy, go through with it. And if at any point along the way you find that you cannot keep this child, we will adopt it for you, no questions asked. And I thought, there you go. Like, if you're marching at a pro-life rally and have no solution for the baby, then that's not acceptable.
That's right.
But Jim has one. So you think about that with every topic that is difficult in our world today. We need to have a theological stance that is based on truth as much as we can interpret truth, right? I mean, nobody's cornered the market on this. That's dangerous to assume, but we need to figure out where we are on all the topics and what we're going to do to minister to people who are living with the topic, struggling with the topic, trying to figure out a way forward with it. And that's the hard part. And the churches that are doing that are growing like crazy, but they're getting shot by arrows from the believers or the
Sure.
pastors, mostly who are not leading growing churches.
Yeah. That's been the case for a long time. We obviously could go on this the rest of the podcast, but I want to talk
This
about
isn't
your
why
book.
we're here, but
You've written a new book. Talk to us about the book. It's called Big Shoes to Fill.
Big shoes to fill. Yeah,
All
big
right,
shoes
let's
to
dive
fill.
into this a little bit.
Yeah, big shoes to fill. The tagline, stepping into leadership roles without stepping in it. So as I began to evaluate my career, and especially through the doctoral work I did, and then working with churches for 2.5 years, and business leaders too, but one of the things I kept seeing was the ramifications for job change today. The research shows that people are changing jobs every 4 years right now. The millennial generation is changing every 3 years. That's not going to get better. That's going to continue to either plateau or get worse.
Yep.
And change jobs more frequently. And so what I was finding is that leaders are stepping into new roles constantly. And most of them, 99% of us, are not founders of something. So therefore, we are stepping into roles that we did not create, and inheriting teams, inheriting systems, inheriting congregations, inheriting cultures that we didn't grow and build. So how do you do that well? So I began talking with leaders about it and realized that none of us really know how to do this well. We don't know how to step into a new role, a new position, whether it's a leader of an entire organization like a church or a leader within the organization, like a youth pastor stepping in. How do you do that well? How do you replace a leader? How do you honor the past without being tied to it? How do you step into a role and engage people as a leader, but not about the position, but creating relational influence, not positional authority? How do you manage all the tensions that you face personally stepping into this?
Yep.
Organizational tensions, team tensions. I mean, it's just a mess. And with the rate of change that's happening in organizations, it's something we have to figure out. And so as I began to process this, I realized, I've done this a few times. I mean, I stepped into what was called Watermark Church 16 years ago. And I was the third lead pastor in 3 years. So I inherited a team. I inherited a congregation. I inherited a community. I inherited promises the previous leader had made. I mean, I think my first Sunday, if I remember, we had $400 in the bank. And on that same Sunday, I had a guy after church ask me if we were still planning on buying a building. I thought, what? I don't know what you're talking about. But the previous guy had made a promise and I inherited the promise. So I have done that a few times myself. And so I began talking with more leaders about it. Interviewed some really dynamic people. Frank Blake, the former CEO of the Home Depot. Cheryl Batchelder, she was the former CEO of Popeyes. I interviewed Samar Masad. He's the leader who replaced me at Woodstock City Church. And so it's fun to hear about what it felt like to
follow you.
And my shoes weren't that big. They were tiny shoes to fill. But
that's your sequel book.
This is my second book. Yeah. Following Me, Tiny Shoes to Fill. So but talk to Sam or talk to William Vanderbloemen, who is a executive, placement agent, but specifically working in the church with church leaders. And so and just the more I talked to him, the more complicated we realized this was. And so we took all the lessons that I had learned, all the lessons they had learned, and really put it into a book to help leaders who are stepping into a new situation, or to help the team who is getting a new leader. How do we do this well? How do we expedite trust? How do we kind of improve the process so that we can move forward more, not just more quickly, but more healthily and thrive through the transition?
Well, one of the things I heard Andy Stanley say a long time ago that I think he said a lot of things that I've remembered, but one of the things he talked about was, he says, at some point, everybody that's in your church today is going to leave.
Yep.
Everybody's going to leave. They're either going to die, they're going to move away because of a job, or they're going to go to a different church. He said, and you're going to, as the leader. So this change you're talking about is not something that's optional to deal with. It's going to happen.
No, yeah. Andy's, I think the quote that I remember from him, I mean, I worked for him for a long time. So, but his leadership is temporary. His stewardship is temporary, and you're accountable, right? So In fact, not to promote this, but I think it's helpful for your audience. On my website, it's easy to find. I have companion guides that are a part of the bonus material for the book. And I wrote a companion guide specifically for church leaders because there are uniquenesses for a church leader that are not going to be seen in the marketplace.
True.
And one of the big ones is, and this, at least with the book, is that when you step into a new role in a church, whether it be a senior pastor role or a student pastor role, it doesn't matter, any role in the church, you're not just replacing the person who came before you. You're also replacing the person, and I think this is so critical, you're replacing the person who everybody probably liked and loved, right? If you're the CEO of an organization, very few, if any, customers even know your name. They don't care. They just really like the chicken sandwich. I mean, the fact that you're the president or the CEO of the organization, nobody even cares. At a church, right? None of us are paid to be there. None of us have to be there. So we end up typically migrating to church communities where we like the leader, the pastor. We like their style. We like their approach. We like how they preach. We like whatever. So when you step in to replace a church leader, you are basically looking at an entire room full of people who don't have to be there, who could get up and walk away and find somebody they like better immediately. So it's very complex. And it can be very challenging on our own ego stepping into those roles because we're not going to keep everybody. And no matter how good or bad you are at it, there's going to be transition, there's going to be turnover. So helping church leaders not just understand that, but helping them navigate through some of that and helping them understand how they can possibly mitigate some of the turnover, not to help themselves, but to help the mission of the church continue to move forward. There are some kind of, tools and tricks of the trade that can help leaders step into these new roles in a way that can help them be more successful.
This is so good. We're going to take a short break, and when we come back, I got to ask you a question about something I've observed. I want to get your take on it. So let's take a short break. We'll be right back with Gavin. Back here with Gavin Adams talking about his new book. Gavin, so you were just talking about what happens when you come into a place. Have you noticed, and this has been what my observation has been, that even if the leader who left in a negative way or was not a great leader, that when you come in to replace them, that person is still the standard?
Yes. It's crazy. I have, this book is divided into four parts, four sections. The third section is all about leading people through the experience of change. And that's really the crux of all leadership is about people anyway, right? If we're not leading people, we're not leading. So people are the problem, but they're also the opportunity. So part 3 is dedicated to how to lead yourself, but also how to lead the people that you are now charged to lead through the transition journey. And what that really is about is leading the emotions they're experiencing. So the first emotion, there's 4, we won't go through all of them now, but the first one is comfort. The second one's grief. And the reason is that we are all experiencing loss. And the only emotion and activity that moves us past loss is grief, right? Because all losses are deaths. So this is one of the most interesting, I think, findings in the research and interviews that I conducted is that, and I have a companion guide for this, if you're replacing a beloved leader or a bemoaned leader, the challenges are unique, yet similar in some ways. Even for the boss, the leader, the pastor, that and I hate that this is true, but maybe there was a moral failure or there was something negative that happens, When they leave, there is still a loss associated to that. And stepping in to that role, I had this experience, not with a moral failure. The guy that was leading before me is one of the most godly men I've ever met, but he had to follow a guy who just left and he was the second in command. They gave him the job, but he didn't necessarily even need it or want it. And he was a very reluctant leader, and that just wasn't what God made him to do. So he did his best. Well, when I took the job, and I was a lot more immature, but when I took the job, I didn't walk in thinking, the Savior is here in any way, but I did walk in thinking, well, at least I like leading, and at least I'm excited about the potential. So I didn't expect a parade, but what I didn't expect is for how much grief the people were going to experience just because someone new was there.
Yes.
And so, and I didn't know this back then. So I became more frustrated with people because I couldn't understand why they were resisting me. I'm like, don't you see the big vision I have? Don't you see the excitement? Can't you feel?
Yep.
And the reality is they could feel all that, but they couldn't experience that until they processed the grief because they had lost something.
Yes.
They had lost a leader who they did like. They had lost a leader who, by the way, even if they didn't believe in as a leader, they still were comfortable with that individual.
It was the culture, that was the atmosphere. Right. And they know change is coming.
Yeah.
But here's what, and I say this all the time. It's all over my podcast. But when you don't know what to do, you go to your default.
Correct.
Because that's comfortable. It's what you know.
Right.
And that's what leaders do, but it's also what people do.
Well, change dislodges comfort. So I talk a lot about that in the book. And the issue with change is the unknown. So we don't resist change. Like no one, Dale, has ever gone to us and said, hey, I want to double your salary. And we said, no, I'm sorry, I'm change resistant. You know, what we resist is the unknowns that the change is going to bring. And so therefore we have to, we really have to grieve the loss of comfort. We have to grieve the loss of what we know. We have to grieve the loss of who we're losing, a friend, or even somebody who we don't like, but at least we understand their expectations.
We knew how it works.
We know how to exist in the culture and succeed.
And as a leader, even if you follow, quote unquote, a bad leader, those people stayed under that person.
Correct.
Okay. Well, so they were still there. And so you can't just dismiss that.
Yeah. Well, we think that, and there is some truth to this, that if you replace a beloved leader, it's going to be challenging. So if you could replace a non-liked leader, it's going to be so much easier. But the reality is that disliked leaders are typically bad leaders. So therefore, they also leave unhealthy teams. So you're inheriting oftentimes a lot of toxic environment, a poisonous culture with honestly, potentially pretty mediocre players. Because the good leaders within the team have left. They're not sticking around.
Yeah, they're not part of it.
In both cases, it's just so challenging. And I think the church element adds another complication that the marketplace just doesn't have.
All right, so I'm going to tap into the wisdom, the depth, the experience of Gavin with this question.
That sounds like too big of a buildup, but go ahead.
Well, it's an interesting. It's a question I think you'll enjoy addressing. So Nick Saban just retired from Alabama. Probably at least now will be revered as the greatest college football coach of all time.
Great.
What would you tell the dude that's replacing him?
Man, so I've already sent a book to them. I don't know if it'll get to the guy. Yeah. If anybody of your audience knows him or knows whatever, let me know. I would tell him that to embrace the journey. It's a marathon, not a sprint. It's always going to get worse before it gets better. It is impossible to replace a leader and expect things to be as good as they were day one, no matter who it is. I mean, in the Nick Saban world, it's impossible. But even let's say, you're replacing the worst leader at Alabama, it's still going to be hard. It's going to get worse at first. It always does. So one, embrace the fact that it's going to get worse. Two, accept the fact that it's not about you. And the problem isn't you. So when there's this tension because of our humanity and our brokenness to assume that everything that happens is our fault, it's our responsibility. The reality is that during a leadership transition, and I hate to say it this way, but it is what it is. There is going to be turnover. There is going to be people who aren't happy. There are going to be players entering the transfer portal.
They're already going,
without even talking to him. And that seems so unfair. And it seems so frustrating that they wouldn't even give you a chance. It's the reality of change and transition. So that's going to be part of it. The other thing I would tell him is to take your time to build the relational connection. People will obey positional authority, but they will follow relational influence.
Okay.
And it is so important to foster relational influence and not assume your position is going to keep people following you. They may obey you, but that's not following you.
Yeah. And in this world of college football right now, I mean, some guys can't make it a year.
Right.
Honestly, to be fair, any new coach should have 3 years to try to make change.
Right.
But boosters don't allow it anymore. And so I totally understand what you're saying.
Yeah. But you have to, I mean, as the leader, and that's the thing, like, I mean, I would tell him, you have to come in and hopefully in the interview process, this is what was agreed upon, is that, hey, one, this is going to be hard for a minute. I know you're used to winning. This is going to be hard. Two, it's going to take a couple of years, not because I don't know what I'm doing, but because we are going to have to allow the dust to settle, and there will be a little bit of a rebuilding. But let me tell you what we're doing. The rebuilding is a relational rebuild. It's not an institutional rebuild. So you're going to have to allow me the time to invest relationally in the coaches. I mean, and think about the organization. You've got players, fans, booster. You've got all of your staff. You've got all the supporting staff. I mean, we're talking hundreds of people who are on the payroll for just the football program, that now as a new coach, you have to foster relational influence with them. So the very first thing I would do is go on a listening tour. I would go sit down with as many people as I possibly can. And I would say, hey, tell me what you've loved about working here. Tell me what has been frustrating for you. And you want to listen. You want to begin to build this relational influence with people, because that's ultimately how you win in any organization or any team, in any one of them. I'll give you another really quick example. I'm in Atlanta. I'm a long-suffering Atlanta native, so Falcons fan it is not great. We just fired our head coach, Arthur Smith. He had 3 years, but as you watch him, again, I don't know him, so I'm making an assumption based on what I've seen and a little what I've heard, but he doesn't appear relationally connected to the people that he's leading. You watch him on the sideline of a game. He's calling the offense, so he's got his head buried in a playbook all the time. Meanwhile, a player is coming off the field. He's not connecting to them. He's buried in a playbook. He has positional authority as the coach. I don't know how much relational influence he has.
That's good.
Meanwhile, you watch a guy like Mike McDaniel, who's coaching, and he's a nut job in a way, but he's coaching the Miami Dolphins. He's young and he's fun and all that, but the players love him. And the reason is that he is highly connected to them relationally. Right. And so back to your question really quick. If I'm looking at the guy at Alabama, I'm going to tell him, hey man, this is going to stink for a while, but the only way to win in the end is to to be a leader worth following. And that doesn't happen because of your title. It's going to happen because of your care, your concern, and your relational connection. So how day one do you plan to start fostering a relationship with people? That's going to be the most important thing. And then secondly, you have to understand the emotions that everyone is going to go through.
Because they got to grieve.
Yes, it is your job as the leader to lead them through the emotional process of change, because they don't know the process. They don't understand the 4 stages that they're going to go through: the loss of comfort and grief and confusion to eventual acclamation. They don't know that. It's your job to know it, and it's your job to help them name it so they can change it and live and lead through it.
That's good stuff. I thought that was just a really relevant situation, which, we all feel like, whoever follows Coach Saban will probably be the sacrificial lamb. And
they don't have to be.
He doesn't have to be, because they did hire a really gifted guy who, if he doesn't make it at Alabama, will go on to win somewhere else. And so,
here's the thing. Like, think about, we're kind of watching this play out right now in a few different churches. There's some that have had, that are large churches that have had some changeover that where the changes come on the heels of something that wasn't good. But look at like Saddleback. It's a great example. Rick Warren left because he committed to leaving at this time. He's been looking at this date for years and years and years, right? They bring a new leader in and things are going well. Why? Well, not just because they strategically thought through the handoff, but the new leader is working so hard to relationally grow his influence with the people who he is now called to lead, right? That's why it's working. You see the other leaders who aren't doing that, well, no wonder it isn't working as well.
Yeah. Okay. We have been all over your book. Give us, kind of walk us through, you said it was 4 sections?
4 sections.
So walk us through. I want to allow enough time to make sure we cover the sections, because obviously we want people to pick the book up. So if I pick up the book, walk me through it.
Yeah, really quick. Section 1 is all about the reality of change, how organizations form and how hard it is to reform them. and all the things that we face, the tensions that we have to learn to manage, personal tensions, team and organizational tensions. And I close section 1 by telling my story of stepping in at Watermark Church that became Woodstock City Church, and what it felt like to step into a leadership role as the new leader of something that I didn't create, and all the things I inherited, and the story of doing that at a coffee shop. We bought a coffee shop, and I stepped in and we led a coffee shop for a year. The church turned out to be a real success story. The coffee shop, not so much. We sold it a year later, or actually abandoned it basically a year later because it wasn't working. So I've got a good and a not so good story. Part 2 is all about what we have to learn. Learn how to learn the team, the organization, the culture, learn how to win, learn how to not label people and things too quickly. It's all about learning so you can earn the right to eventually lead. Part 3, I mentioned earlier, it's all about leading people through the emotions of the transition. Again, if we can't lead people, I love this. I worked in change management for all these years in the marketplace. Change management is really helpful, but if you don't understand the people leadership of change management, no change can happen successfully. So part 3 is dedicated to the emotions of change, your job as the leader, helping people understand what they're feeling, why they're feeling it, and how to move through it. And then part 4, in a weird way at first, is all about what do you do once you've earned the right to be the leader? What do you do when you're not the new leader anymore? And so part 4 is about preparing for the next leader. As we said earlier, leadership is temporary, and you're not going to be the leader forever. You are going to change. You're going to retire or win the lottery or move on to a new job, and someone else is going to now step into your shoes. So how can you prepare now to help that next leader succeed in your absence? So that's the 4 sections.
The 4th section is where I was going to go. So this is awesome. In my observation, it seems to me that most churches either don't prepare a succession plan at all or wait too late to do that. What have you seen?
Well, yeah, both of those are true. I've seen the same thing. And having worked in the marketplace for a while before getting into ministry, I experienced, I think in a lot of ways, a better handling of succession. And not always at CEO level, right? But even just at lower level teams and some of those things. So with lots of promotions and lots of opportunities coming in some of these places I'd worked at, you're always engaging with new team members, new leaders, new managers. So in the church, we do not seem to do that well. We build so many things around our personality, and it's hard not to, and you kind of have to in a way. But we don't do a good job of thinking about the mission moving forward. And to be honest, I say this about parenting all the time. I don't think you really know how good of a job you did as a parent until your kids become parents.
Absolutely.
The jury's out, right?
Absolutely.
I think it's the same thing in leadership. I don't think we know how good of a job we did leading until somebody else is leading what we were leading. And if we think like that the whole time, we're always thinking with the end in mind. So, I don't know that I did this right all the time, but when I hired Samar Masad to be our college pastor, 7.5 or whatever years before he took my job, I knew in the interview process, he was the kind of guy who could take my job one day. And it didn't take long for me to recognize that he had the skill, the ability, the passion for the local church to be even better than me in this job. So 2 years into his time, I invited him in to the leadership table. I invited him to our executive team. I had him sitting beside me through every hard conversation, through every decision, the small ones and the big ones, because I wanted him to be prepared, whether it was for my job or a lead pastor job somewhere else, so that he could be ready. Because again, my real legacy is the mission of that church, not me.
Yes.
And so I wanted that church to be more successful after I left than not. And that's hard, right? Because when things succeed without you, it is hard on our ego and our brokenness. But what are we really trying to build,
Oh, yeah.
And I wanted to build the capital K kingdom, not my little K kingdom. And so I began preparing for that 6 years before I left.
I have just this is amazing me. It is, I would say, in my leadership, especially the last few years of working with 95 Network, this is the biggest question I have is why don't pastors I mean, they know they're going to leave. They know they're going to retire. They know they're going to die. They understand that, and they know they
Right.
need to hand off ministry. But it seems like there's not a clock in their head
I know.
that tells them when it's time. And see, with you, you even said, you identified, you planned, and you have been trained in leadership. So it's a little bit different than most
Yes.
pastors because they
I do have an
weren't
advantage with
trained.
that. Yeah.
They weren't trained in that. But it just amazes me the lack of urgency. And
Well,
the
you know what I
urgency.
have,
Go ahead.
yeah. Dale, one of the things I think is so critical in this, though, is that even if you struggle to recognize that our days are all numbered, right?
Mm-hmm.
Even if you struggle to think about that from a leadership context or a pastoral context, I think it's still so critical to always be replacing yourself.
Yes.
Because even if the person that you're training, or hopefully more than one, even if all the people that you're pouring into, even if they don't replace you, they're going to go on and do something bigger.
Yes.
And so that was Sammer. I didn't know if he was going to replace me. I didn't know if we could keep him long enough, honestly,
Mm-hmm.
to replace me, because I didn't know when I was leaving. But I did know that he was going to lead a church one day.
Yeah.
And I didn't want him to step into that role unprepared.
Mm-hmm.
So I felt like it was a part of my duty, my job, to prepare him, because the kingdom matters too much for him to be unprepared. I don't want him to spend 2 years having to learn the ropes when he could have learned it with me. And so with every leader of caliber like that, and even those that weren't going to move into senior pastor roles, they were going to hopefully grow into other roles and have
Mm-hmm.
more influence. So what are we doing to constantly develop the people near us and around us for whatever God has for them, right? And if we're doing that, whether it's intentional or not, for ourselves, we are replacing ourselves.
That
We're
question would
preparing.
be the question if I could sit down with every pastor that listens to the podcast and every pastor, that would be the question. What are you doing to replace yourself?
Yeah.
See, and that's the point of what I was asking. It's not a point in time down the road that you figure out,
No.
okay, I'm going to be leaving. You need to be doing that today. One
Yep.
of our teammates, John Sanders, travels with us and does some of our conferences, and he always asks this question. He'll say, "How many of you came by yourself today?" And all the pastors will raise their hand, and he'll just say, "I'm not picking on you, but I just want to ask you this question: Why didn't you bring someone with you?
Right.
Do you not have a young person on your staff you're training? Why would you not have them here with you at this
Yep.
conference? If nothing else, just for the ride here and back."
Exactly.
And if I'm not mistaken, isn't that what discipleship really is?
Right. I know. Well, and I don't think that, I mean, I'm sure there are some pastors that don't do this well, just out of pure ego and all that. But I think the
Yeah,
reality of most pastors is not that.
not at
I
all.
just think I think it's just a lack of intentionality.
Mhm.
It's just a lack of thinking about that. And let's be honest, there's nothing more organizationally heavy than the local church. I mean, think
Mhm.
about, again, I work with so many business leaders and they have R&D departments and all these things. And in the local church, man, every 7 days, and it feels like every 4, we have this thing to put on.
Mhm.
And most of us are putting it on with just a couple of people at best and some volunteers. It's all on our shoulders.
Mhm.
It's hard to think about I use the phrase that several of us use this, but it's really hard to work on it when all of your life is spent working in it.
That's right.
And replacing yourself as a work on it thing. And
Mhm.
it's really challenging for pastors to do that.
Yeah.
If you're taking 10 to 20 hours to work on a sermon, you're trying to re-engage volunteers. There's so much to do. And so I do think there are some healthy, valid excuses. However, they are still excuses. We
Mhm.
have to figure out a way to bring people along beside us. And what you just said is the way. It doesn't have to be some really well thought out, a leadership development strategy. I mean, the best leadership development strategy is just come follow me.
Mhm.
Just sit
There's a guy
beside
in
me.
the Bible who did that.
Correct. That's my point. It's like, just come sit beside me.
Mhm.
Come watch how I write content. Come watch how I think about sermons. Come watch how I prepare. Come watch how I recruited these people.
Mhm.
It's just come do it with me. To your point, I know so many pastors today whose lives were really changed in a positive way as a leader on church bus trips back from a conference. I mean, one church I work with went from being a Mennonite church to being a wildly successful reaching-oriented church in their community because they attended a conference and on the car ride back, reevaluated their strategy as a team. There's only 3 of them.
Yeah.
And decided how they all were going to make this change.
That's so cool.
And it was, to your point, it was the conference, but it really wasn't. It was the time together, you know? Yep. And the lead pastor alone could not have done that.
You're exactly right. It's relational.
Correct.
But here's the thing. So I want to make sure I'm fair to our small church pastors. I know you're overwhelmed. I know
that was my point. That's why
so many things. But I address this a lot. Most small churches are known for doing 20 things poorly instead of one or two things well. I want to give you permission today to cut away some of this stuff and value things that are going to benefit today, but also going to benefit the kingdom in the future, and not just yourself. But by being intentional, because you can't do everything, but you certainly can have people you hang out with. You know, you can eat a Chick-fil-A biscuit with somebody, and that is discipleship as well. Yeah. So as we wrap up the podcast, I want to ask you this question. And let's say 5 years, you sit down and you look back at the book and how it impacted people. What do you hope happens?
Yeah, that's a great question. You know, in 5 years, and I'll answer for our church leaders. You know, I mean, I hope the marketplace does well, and you know, I hope leaders in the marketplace learn to lead people better and all that. And that's something I work with a lot. But for the local churches, I really hope that we can thrive through leadership changes and transitions, because when we can't successfully change leaders for healthy reasons, right? I mean, not for unhealthy, or either, it doesn't matter. But if we can't successfully engage new leaders into the local church, we lose ground with every unsuccessful leadership transition.
Yep.
We lose people, and therefore we lose ground in the gospel. We lose ground in the kingdom. And that drives me crazy. The thought that a local church can't adapt and can't evolve, and part of this is because of leadership changes. If they can't do that well, we lose an opportunity in the community. And I just hate for that to happen. And so my hope would be that current leaders understand that it is temporary. They're not going to be the leader forever. That new leaders walking in understand, while it's really going to be hard to step into this new space, there are some things they can do to make it successful. And there are some things they can do to remove their ego from it. And there's some things they can do to prioritize the people around them and gain relational influence in the process. And maybe God can leverage that to the benefit of the kingdom. That's what I hope would be the story.
The book is Big Shoes to Fill by
Gavin
Adams. Well, obviously going to have all the links to things we've talked about today in the show notes. Thank you for taking the time to hang out with me today. We obviously could talk a lot longer, but you know, at some point people have got to go and do work.
But we both get paid to talk about church. So that's, yeah.
Well, thank you again for joining me.
You're very welcome. Thanks.
Thanks for listening to the 95 Podcast. We look forward to sharing another episode with you next week. In the meantime, visit our website at 95network.org. The website is loaded with great resources created for small and mid-sized church leaders. Until next time, have a great week.